Hey, what's up, friends? Ray with Docket Timberworks. How y'all doing? We've got a fun one today. We're going to turn a small little bowl out of Norwegian maple. You know, friends, not all bowls have to be big monsters and giant showpieces. Sometimes these cute little bowls are just what you need, the perfect size for candy, nuts, cottage cheese, ice cream, that type of thing. You know, a good sized little handheld utility bowl. Plus, they're really cute. So stick around, see how we turn this bowl, and see how it comes out. Okay, so some of you might not be familiar with Norway maple or Norwegian maple, and it's not native to here in America, you know, hence the name Norwegian maple, right? So, but it's been transplanted over here, and it's used mainly as a decorative lawn tree. And they don't get very big, but they have a nice, beautiful canopy, kind of a dark green leaf, nice tight bark. And I believe there's a couple of varieties. There's also a King Crimson Norway maple that in fall has red leaves, really dark red leaves, and it's pretty cool. And during the normal time, they look almost dark purple. So it's also not to be considered a soft maple like silver and red or box elder. It's more on par with sugar maple on the Janka hardness. And so it's a really cool wood. Might be a little bit hard to come by because they don't normally come down. People don't want to get rid of their decoration trees, right? You want to keep those for the shade and the look of and the aesthetic of your house. So whenever I see one come down or hear about it, I jump on it and try to get as much of it as I can because it's a cool wood. It's a nice, beautiful, kind of mellow looking maple. So I don't know if you caught it in the very opening seconds, but on a small blank like this, what I'll do is I will mount the piece with a mortise, and I just go ahead and use my drill press and use a 2 1/8 inch Forstner bit, and that's perfect for a 2-inch long nose jaws to slightly, just barely fit in there and expand and hold the piece to start with. And it gives you a good firm grip and mounting solution. So it's one of my favorite go-to methods on these smaller bowls. And right now I'm using a 1/2 inch spindle gouge. And if you're curious on how I sharpen these, a lot of people will give them a really sharp nose angle in the 35 to 30 degree range. I keep things simplified by sharpening all my gouges to 40 degrees on a platform. That way I don't have to mess with any jigs, any angle adjustments. I just go over to my platform and I hand sharpen it. So my spindle gouge, my bowl gouge, and my spindle roughing gouge are all done at 40 degree nose angle on a platform. And I got this idea 100% from Stuart Batty, you know, and he's a big proponent of platform sharpening and using 40 degrees on his 40/40 bowl gouge. And then he also says, while you're there, you might as well sharpen all the other gouges at that angle and just set it once and forget about it. And then you're done. You know, the difference between 40 and 35 degrees is minute. The wood's not going to know the difference. The only difference you might come into is maybe fitting your tool down in a tight recess. But at that point, I also shave off the heel of my spindle gouge. So I shave quite a bit off because you're not using it as a long overhang tool anyways, where you might want the extra support and full strength of the full diameter of the bar stock. I'm not worried about that. This is more of a detailed tool or a light work tool. And so it can be ground down a little bit thinner, and I don't have to worry about the stresses of the wood coming at it. It's also a 1/2 inch tool, so I'm not really using it on big monster pieces. And also lately, I've been into the idea of I watch a lot of Thomas Love and a lot of Richard Rappin, and often they will leave a foot on the bowl. They will not turn it away. It saves a lot of time from reversing and get removing that tenon. So, I mean, it doesn't look right on every piece, but a lot of these smaller little utility bowls that don't need a large wide base, it looks pretty sharp. And so also right now I'm playing with the idea of a beaded rim, which I've only done once before on a cherry bowl before this. So as I'm shaping the bowl and removing material, I leave some room up at the rim, and I left it pretty wide. And then that's when I got the idea of why not do multiple beats. So, I don't usually have much of a game plan other than, hey, let's go turn a bowl. You know what I mean, friends? I just kind of, everything's on the fly, and things just kind of work out as they go. And so, like I said, I have this large area up here, and so I got the idea to roll a couple of fine beads in there. And so this is also where you need your spindle gouge, and it's good practice. I've watched Richard do the whole side of a bowl as beads, and I did it on a Christmas tree, and it was a fun little exercise. I'm making sure I do it right now on the outside while it's still solid so that it retains its shape while I'm trying to roll the bead. I do believe I mess up the top bead a little bit when I hollow the bowl, and it's not symmetrical. The bottom two beads look perfectly fine and in line, and the top one got shaved down a little too much. But it's just, learning steps as you go. And so right here I'm kind of blocking in the beads, if you will. I'm trying to get a nice transition of the curve. The curve still has to be complete and look good and have a smooth transition from the bottom to the top. And so once the curve is established, and then I block in the actual area of the beads, then I can go in and start rolling the three beads. But this area right here just below the beads has to be perfect, because that's where your hand's going to be, and that's where you're going to feel if the bowl isn't shaped right or perfect. So you just got to take time. And so now I'm actually working the process of the beads, and I'm trying to round them over, and it's spindle work. It's open the flute, close the flute, open the flute, close the flute, come back and do it the opposite direction. And sure, you're cutting uphill against unsupported grain when you roll the bead back down towards the foot, but it's only a small surface, and if you don't, your beads will be lopsided, and you're not really going to get a lot of torn fiber right there anyways, and you can just touch it up with a little bit of sandpaper if you do. And that's me repeatedly feeling the smoothness, looking for ingrain tear out. And I'll come back and I'll touch up the tenon, because like I said, I want this to be a decorative tenon, and I'm not going to remove it. And so I want kind of like a little shelf down at the bottom, and then often when I leave these decorative tenons, I'll put a groove. And so here it is. I'm just using a spindle gouge. I didn't switch tools at all. It's just, it's hard to see in these angles, but basically you hold the tool kind of low, the tool handle low, and right as you're entering the cut, you raise the handle to enter the cut. And that should hopefully, if you're closed over perfect, like at a perfect 90 degree, and you don't push the tool in, you raise the handle and it levers the tool down into the wood, you don't get escape back. So take a little bit of time, learn those entry techniques with your gouges, and that will save you a lot of heartache. if you just push the tool sideways or laterally into the wood, more often than not, you're going to get a skate back. But if you start with your handle low and raise it up, and that draws the cutting edge into the wood down with the rotation of the wood, as opposed to putting it in perpendicular, it just seems to be a lot smoother transition, and I don't get as much skate back. So here I'm thinking it's going to, I didn't really measure the tenon properly, and I just kind of eyeballed it and made the tenon. So I'm worried about leaving compression marks, or more than the compression marks, I'm worried about leaving the black stain from the iron or steel jaws on the wet wood. So I grab a piece of plastic baggie, and I'm doing that to try and protect the finish surface of the tenon. And so it was too thick with a whole bag, the double layers. So I separated the bag into one layer, and it's fitting pretty good. I like it. So not only is this a trick to try and prevent marring on your tenon, it also is useful if you took your tenon down too far and you can't get a good grip on it. You can add a little bit of plastic baggie or paper towel, shop towel, whatever you have available, and now you could probably re-grip that tenon with a firm grip and full compression of the jaws, and not have it slide around or lever up out of the jaws. And so here you can see the recessed mortise that I had drilled with the Forstner bit, and you can also see where I took down some of the top of the bowl and made it more a clean surface. So I just come back and even everything out, and I'm trying not to take too much off the top in this evening process, because I don't want to ruin the beads that I put on the top. I have to be very careful here and not take too much material off the rim or get a skate back across the top of the bowl and mess up the finish of the beads. And now my go-to method for establishing a depth hole, or I call it a depth hole, but it's establishing the bottom depth of the bowl. So basically what you do is you drill a hole at the depth of where you want the bottom of the bowl to be. And that gives you a guideline of how far to go and how far not to go down, and so you don't blow a hole out through the bottom. So this is also a very good reason to keep that little decorative tenon on the bottom, okay? Because it will allow you to go through a lot more material than you would normally be able to, and not have a funnel. So, it's kind of, I try not to go through the bottom of these and into there. I try to go where my depth hole is, so if I don't like the look of the bowl, I can reverse the bowl and remove the tenon. But it's also a safety net in case you do go too deep in there, you don't get a blowout. So I'm like I said, I'm a real big proponent of leaving the foot on. A lot of turners are against it and say it's this or that, or a bowl isn't finished if it has a foot on it, or but they're critical. They're super critical of the work. The average person, the average consumer that buys these does not care one bit. And in fact, most of my bowls that have a foot on the bottom outsell the ones that I take the time to remove it. I don't know if it's because it elevates it and it's easier to get your hand underneath, or it elevates it and it's easier to see the slope and the curves, but for whatever reason, they really seem to outsell the ones where I take the extra 30 minutes to remove the tenon and get a more refined product. So I don't even bother with it most of the times now. I just leave it on there. Of course, mileage may vary. There are some bowls where it just doesn't look right and it needs to be removed. So, and that's why it's a good idea to follow the parameters that you set with your depth hole, and actually don't overshoot them, and just, you know, so you can remove that tenon if you don't like the way it looks. On this, I switched to a 3/8 bowl gouge. Why? My spindle gouge could have done it no problem because I never use it. I turn 95% of bowls with my 5/8 bowl gouge, and I have this 3/8 bowl gouge, and this is a perfect candidate to use it. Use up some steel, you know, that never gets used otherwise. So that and a 3/8 bowl gouge gives you a very nice finish. It gives really, these are hogging cuts right now, but when you come back through and you take your time and you do a finishing cut, it's a really nice surface with a 3/8 gouge, and it will remove material. You can hog some material with a 3/8 gouge. Don't get me wrong. It's not, you know, a little Tonka toy training wheels gouge by any means. It can hog some material. You just can't have the overhang that you can with a full length or a full size 5/8 gouge. But as you can see, it's making short work of this hard maple, and I will call it hard maple because it's like I said, it's up there on the Jenga scale, this Norwegian maple. Okay, so I'm going over, and I wanted to touch up the rim, but once the rim gets kind of on the thin side, I usually like to use a bottom feeding bowl gouge to cut across the rim. It just seems to work that small area delicately and just does a nice job with it. And so this bowl looks a little bit on the thick side right here, but you got to remember that I've got that bead. And so we have to be careful that we don't go through the side of the bowl down more towards the foot area, the bottom third of the bowl, because it's deceiving. That bead makes it look like this is a full 1/4 inch thick or whatever, but it's actually, you know, a little bit on the thinner side. It's just the beads at that rim makes you think you're working with more material than you actually are. But the sound of the tool and the feel of the bowl, and, you know, I use my finger calipers, will tell you otherwise. And so I am cleaning up the inside with a negative rake scraper, and it gives a good clean cut on here, and it lets me kind of fine tune the inside curve. And that was just simply a Robert Zorby bowl scraper that I went ahead and ground a negative, a secondary bevel on the top. So it's one of my favorite tools, and this is a smaller one. This isn't my big butter cutter. It's just a round nose scraper that I reprofiled into an asymmetrical bowl scraper. Okay, and I'm not locked into using one tool, and I like to bounce around a lot, and I have a bunch of tools on the wall, so I like to use them. I like to get different feels for different tools at the end at different times. So this is a basically square inch scraper, but I have a slight radius on it, and so I am using it as a traditional scraper, not a negative rake, to clean up the bottom and even things out. And it turned out pretty good. You know, not everything has to be a negative rake, and it was for bulk removal. And so I'll clean things up with the negative rake round nose and transition into the bottom and get a nice finish. Sorry about the hat. You know, it happened. I kind of have a problem in that I'm constantly grinding and regrinding my tools. So I don't always have a traditional scraper that's a round nose at the time, because that used to be one, but then I put a negative rake on it. So I'm constantly fiddling and playing with the different grinds on my tools and finding out what I like, what I don't like, trying different techniques. I don't lock myself into one way of doing things, one person's methodology, one instructor's way of doing something. I like to play around and figure it out myself. I don't take somebody's word that this is the right way to do it until I figure it out myself and whether I like it or not. And so what I was complaining about was I dinged the rim and had to trim it down a little bit, clean it up so it's a nice smooth surface, and that's where I lost the symmetric finish on the top piece. Right there is when I had to clean it up. I think when I used that bottom feeding bowl gouge, I missed it somehow or got a little liquid grain, and then I had to go back and clean it up with that negative rake. But that's what that was. And I'm just showing a little bit of the sanding process. I started doing it by hand because I had the sandpaper there and handy, and then, you know, if it's not cutting the job or whatever, I'll move on to the next step. And so what I did was then I've got a inertia sander that I use in here also. And what I'm feeling is I'm feeling probably scratches, right, from using just plain hand sandpaper on the inside of the bowl. So you get less predictable scratches when you use a rotating sander, whether it be a hand sander like this or a power drill. Well, you know, I don't often use this sander, but I saw it was out on the table, so I started using it. You know, use them tools, man. You pay money for them, you might as well get your mileage out of them, right? I'm not saying that this thing's better than a power drill in any way, shape, or form, but I have it, and it fits in here good. I like the foam cup on it. It works good. So use it. And I just run through my standard grits. I go 120, 180, 240, sometimes 320, sometimes I'll leave it at 240. It all just depends on what finish I think I'm going to use or what. A lot of times if I use Axe wood paste, I'll leave it at 240. This, I think I was just going to put walnut oil on it, so I went ahead and took it up the extra step to 320. But yep, see, there's the Mahoney's walnut oil. So just a simple, easy to do little nut bowl. And, you know, everybody loves a grain pop. You got to love it. And you got to make sure that you get the oil deep down into the grooves. And so sometimes when I turn a green bowl like this, I will come back and have to resand it sometimes. Sometimes the drying process works a little bit weird and it'll get raised grain and a little bit of fuzz. And so, but this one came out really good. I just had to put one more coat of walnut oil on it after it completely dried, and it came out fantastic. I love this little bowl. I've been tempted to keep it because it's so cute and just looks really good. It's just a sharp looking piece. And I'll try and get some still gallery in here at the end of the bowl so that you guys can see what I mean, how it looks sharp. And then also, you know, so that you can see some of the little bit of warpage. Those beads will help you highlight the shifting and moving of your little nut bowl. So I really appreciate y'all sticking around and watching the video. So please do the cool social media things. Give me a like, subscribe to the channel if you already haven't, share it to social media, your friends, your family, whoever you think might get some fun and use out of it. And I really appreciate it. I hope to get more content moving at a regular basis. I am still in the process of decompressing and unpacking the garage. We moved all the stuff from the pods into the garage. Now we have to separate and unpack it. I also don't have 220 in my garage, so I might have to run my Rikon lathe for a while until I can get an electrician out here and get me a couple of outlets hooked up. So I believe this is one of the last bowls of Michigan footage. I have a platter demo that's coming up where I'll show you how to use iridescent paint, so stay tuned. That will be the next one. And I believe I have some chainsaw work of breaking down massive logs into bowl blanks, and that should be about the end of my Michigan footage, and I need to start getting some new Texas footage for y'all. Thanks, friends. We'll catch you on the next one.